the opening of the 44th Parliament.
Thank you, Clerk. Senator Whish-Wilson.
Thank you, Deputy Chair. I'm very privileged to be able to do this reply to the Governor-General's speech, the speech of the current government, and I'm especially fortunate to be doing it nearly 6 months after I started, because I'm in continuation. And I was just reflecting in my first few minutes in the speech about what Al Gore said on the 7:30 report in relation to climate change and the Abbott government's attempts to repeal the carbon package. And he very clearly said, our democracy has been hijacked by vested interests or special interests. And an incredulous Annabel Crabb said, surely you're not mentioning some sort of conspiracy theory here, and said, no, this is how it works in politics. And looking back on it now, this was my feeling from listening to the Governor-General's speech, that it didn't have any vision, and it was all about tearing down existing legislation which my party feels is good public policy. And interestingly enough, I was actually sitting next to Kevin Rudd during the Governor-General's speech, because I had a vacant spot next to me, and he said the same thing. He said, where's the vision? Where's the vision? I don't know if anyone was listening, but I certainly was, because I felt the same thing. And looking at what's transpired in the last 6 months in this chamber and in this parliament, I'd have to say my initial thoughts, which I was reflecting on at the beginning of my speech, have turned out to be correct. What Mr Gore was actually referring to is commonly called the special interest effect. It's well studied, understood and accepted by economists, sociologists and students of political science, but we seldom really hear much about it. It explains why vested interests, usually big, powerful, profit-seeking corporations, often win in politics, why they often get their own way. And they have a very simple but persuasive strategy. Because they're well-resourced, often through front groups and lobbying groups, they lobby hard and they're effective. But according to special interest theory, they can concentrate the benefits and costs to decision-makers such as politicians on issues like the policies we've been discussing in this chamber, like the mining tax, or the tax on, I should say, the super profits of miners, or on a price on carbon, or on financial services reforms. The benefits are very clear. They're often political donations or other carrots, and the costs are such things as the threats of high-profile advertising and political campaigns against MPs and governments, or legal challenges. And I remember the advertising campaign around the super profits tax that helped unseat Mr Rudd, who was sitting next to me during the Governor-General's speech. So I'm sure he's very aware of the special interest effect in this country. But the reasons for the success of powerful industry lobby groups go much deeper than this. There's another side to the ledger. Any decision-maker on an issue of importance faces a trade-off. Face the big powerful corporations on one hand, or face a potential backlash from the people, the voters on the other hand. Sadly, both experience and theory tells us in this trade-off it is usually in a politician's self-interest to back powerful vested interests over the public interest. Why is this the case? Because of what economists term the rational ignorance of voters. The costs are too high for voters to devote the significant time and resources to fully understand the issues, especially if they're not accurately reflected in the media, especially when they're busy putting food on the table and getting on with their busy lives. And what is a benefit to them if they do understand these issues? Often the costs to an individual aren't acute and they're spread out over long periods of time. And they're even transferred to future generations, which of course is the definition of sustainability. So from a simple cost-benefit point of view, it's rational to remain ignorant, to a point at least. Throw in the fact that there are a multitude of other factors, things important to individual voters, and it's unlikely that one thing will significantly influence their vote. So a poly can often assume they are safe from voter backlash on single issues. Now, this is a political and economic theory that's been long-standing. Also throw in the fact that these issues are complex and it's in vested interests' own interest to make them complicated and to put out disinformation that muddy the waters on these issues. And of course a lot of that disinformation on various debates I've heard in this chamber here as well. One issue that I feel very strongly about and have campaigned on for years before I came into the Senate is to get a recycling refund in place. for single-use plastics, especially plastic bottles and what's often called cash for containers. And the power of the Food and Grocery Council has always been really obvious to me, and the impact that they have on decision makers. And I've seen Coca-Cola and other beverage companies and the way they've behaved around changes to legislation to give this country a bottle bill. And it's no surprise to me, their power, but it is a surprise to me that a lobbyist on behalf of the Beverage Council was actually in a parliamentary staff as an advisor to a minister. It just shows you how entrenched lobbyists and special interests are in our political system. And I also believe that this same theory explains why it is such rubbish that the coalition, the Liberal and National parties claim a mandate on just about every issue that suits them. Because the world's a lot more complex than that, and there's no science that says exactly how people vote when they go to the polling booth. So, Al Gore was right. Our democracy has been undermined. Not always, but has been undermined when special interests don't have any regard for the public good, when they're only looking after the interests of their members. And advocacy groups are exactly the same. So if you consider the carbon tax repeal bill that we've now passed through the Senate, who is most vocal in support of repealing that bill? Yes, you guessed it, the big end of town. The cheer squad includes the Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry, the Australian Industry Group, the Business Council of Australia and the Mineral Council of Australia. Industry calls for swift repeal of carbon tax. One of the headlines I picked out from newspapers. Absolutely. Of course they would. It's in their interests of their members to call for a repeal of a price on carbon. But our job is to look at the much bigger issues here and the public good, not just the good of a few large businesses, especially considering that only 0.01% of Australian businesses are liable to pay a carbon price, and that 4 companies alone pay nearly 50% of Australia's carbon liability, concentrated in a very small number of industries. And this demonstrates how effective the big polluters have been in this country in influencing the Liberal national government and, sadly, attempts to change our legislation. We've already been through the mineral resource rent tax in detail in the last week, but we've got 10 to 20 companies out of 300 originally touted who've been impacted there. We've seen attempts to change EPBC laws and hand back powers to the states because the same big business cheer squad are asking for it. We've seen changes to New South Wales environmental laws in that state that put the economy above the environment. And another area of interest to me, the so-called free trade deals that we're negotiating, which are almost entirely being pushed by vested interests. And we're talking about significant global multinationals, not just the self-interest and vested interests of Australian companies, but those of multinational corporations domiciled in other countries, the interests of US corporations, and of course how that may impact Australian sovereignty in terms of how we legislate in the public interest. That's all on the table with Trojan horse clauses called investor-state dispute settlement. And it's no secret that my party, the Greens, feel that the government has a very important role to play in standing up to vested interests and balancing the equation and making sure all interests are represented, not just some. It's about restoring balance to this government's extreme agenda, putting the interests and profits of corporation ahead of the people. And nowhere is this more important than in tackling climate change. The role of government in correcting market failures, and the biggest market failure of all time is climate change. No more about this rubbish about the cost of living. We should be discussing the cost of living with climate change. Mr Deputy President, I don't want to give the impression that I'm anti-business, because I'm not. I've worked for big and small business for many years before coming into this role in the Senate. And I actually have spent years chasing a buck. I lived for my bonus at the end of the year. But I've also had a different life in the past decade in Tasmania, and I have genuinely glimpsed an alternative reality. We don't need as much as we think to be happy, and the community, environment and nature should be central to our thinking and our decision-making. And in this regard, tackling global warming as the biggest threat facing my generation and the generation of the children watching me as I speak is an issue we have to take seriously, and it is more important than the short-term costs to the profits of the big polluters in this country. I won't go into... I was, of course, 6 months ago happy to go into a lot of detail, which we've already seen in this chamber around climate change, but clearly food security, loss of crops, effects on drinking water, these aren't just environmental issues, these are also anthropogenic issues and economy issues, economic costs to future generations, which will, if the forecasts are right, and we've seen even more in recent weeks, will lead to trillions of dollars worth of damage and costs to our global economy. We've already seen billions of dollars to individual weather events. Who knows what it will stack up into the future? We need to mitigate and we need to take action against this now. And I do remember going to AgFest in Tassie last year, and I saw at the Liberal Party tent. I've got to say they must have spent a lot of money. They certainly were very impressive in their display. They had a picture of a Holden ute, a big pull-up ute, and it said, "Climate change will cost you a ute every year." And I remember Christine Milne saying, "Climate change will cost you your farm if you don't get behind taking effective action." And really, that's the debate in this chamber that we need to try and find balance in. And looking at Tasmania with a few minutes that I've got left, Tasmania has been a beneficiary of a price on carbon because we produce clean energy and we do export that clean energy. The dividends range between $70 and $200 million a year to Hydro Tasmania because of a price on carbon. We're never going to get that back if these bills get reformed and repealed. It is very important to my state. It accounts for 12.5% of Tasmania's non-Canberra revenues. 12.5%. So while we're talking about, and I notice Senator Smith is certainly one of the champions in this chamber about taking GST money away from Tasmania, have a think about how you're going to give us that money back, Senator Smith. How you're going to replace that money. Not to mention the fact that the mining boom has put significant upward pressure on the exchange rate, which has been one of the negative impacts on my economy. It's called Dutch disease, Senator, and everybody knows about it. And it's never discussed in here. The impact on manufacturing and the agricultural community of a high Australian dollar. So let's be fair and reasonable about how we share out the pie in this country and not claim that my state, that's had 70 years of sucking on the teat, suddenly wants to take money off other states. We've also seen a change in Tasmania in recent weeks. The people in Tasmania have voted for a new government. But there are significant areas that we need to have tripartisan support on in Tasmania. The importance of our scientific community and the money that they need for research, and the importance of the University of Tasmania, and the importance of finding a truly sustainable forestry industry and a way forward to look after our natural assets that are so important to Tasmania's economy. It is what we have a competitive advantage on. Every other state would love to have our forests, our wild areas. In fact, most people in the world would give their left leg to have them. And they are what brings people to my state, and it is one of the biggest generators of employment and income. We need to look after them, and we need to put them first. One of my famous quotes, Mr Deputy President, is from Hernán Cortés, the most famous of the Spanish conquistadors. And he said, "My men and I suffer from a disease of the heart that can only be cured by gold." The Conquistadors is a sad tale of the consequences of greed, of always wanting more, and of enough never being enough. It is not too different in our modern society, where corporate greed and a never-ending search for increasing profits can undermine our democracy. I don't want to see in the next 3 years of this Liberal national government the heart of this big nation further infected by an incurable disease, the never-ending, never-satiated, profit-seeking behaviour of a few big, powerful corporations. Politics is the art of the possible, and it's about showing leadership. I strongly believe it is possible to do our bit to stop climate change, to care for people, to be good international citizens, to be real and not phony. To do something real, I don't believe this. I wouldn't be here today if I didn't believe this. But this is going to require standing up to special interests and breaking the nexus that so often hijacks our democracy. It's about making the Australian people truly understand these arguments and getting action in this chamber.
Senator Whish-Wilson.